targeted 200 businesses in Greater Accra region. And these businesses operate in agriculture, industry, and services. That's all the broad sectors of the economy. And normally we conduct the survey across the whole nation, but this time around, because of COVID limitations, we had to limit it to only the Greater Accra region. But of course, as the conditions improve, subsequent surveys will cover the entire nation. And in the survey, in general, we sought the views of the business executives and owners on business performance, how their businesses are performing, what their views are in terms on the business environment, what kind of constraints face them, and then what kind of policies do they expect government, policy interventions do they expect government to undertake to help improve their businesses. Now, what we do is that we will put these results together, with your input. This is the preliminary report. This is not our final report. So when we receive your inputs, we will use it as relevant, to improve the report. And then we will formulate recommendations which we will then disseminate to policymakers and relevant stakeholders. And then we normally follow it with some kind of advocacy to push for the implementation of our recommendations. Now, in terms of methodology, those of you who are quantitatively inclined, we use the stratified sampling method. In other words, the subjects, the sample were organized into groupings according to the sectors that I mentioned. So the groupings were in agriculture, industry, and services. As I said, we targeted 200 businesses, but in the end, we received responses from 157 of them. And this was after we had put in a lot of effort and time. It wasn't easy. So the response rate is about 78.5%. We think this is fairly good in a COVID environment. I mean, this is good. And then we use both online and in-person, field activities to conduct the survey. And then data entry, processing, analysis were done using SPSS, and then Microsoft Excel to arrive at simple descriptive statistics, which we use for the analysis. So that is the methodology that we adopted. Now, first, we surveyed the background of the businesses. And I don't know whether the diagram, you can see it clearly. Some of us, it's a bit distant away, but those of you who have good eyes, I think you can see it. So you can see that the businesses that we surveyed in agriculture, industry, and services, the services businesses dominated the sample. Of course, we know that Ghana, the services sector is a dominant sector. Presently, I don't know, its contribution to GDP hovers around 50%. But in this sample, we have as much as 75% of the businesses we sampled belonging to the services sector. And part of the explanation possibly is that they were more accessible. This is a COVID environment, in which we conducted, and they were sort of more accessible, and then they were also more responsive, to our questionnaire. In fact, if those were the broad sectors, agric, industry, and services, but we also went into the detailed sectors of the economy. In other words, the agriculture sector is broken down further into those operating in crops, livestock, fishing, forestry, and logging. And then the industry also broken down further into food processing, manufacturing, oil and gas, and construction. And then services is broken down into financial services, transportation, telecommunications, trade, which was dominant. I mean, retail trade and wholesale trade, as you can see from the table. And then hotels and restaurants, education, healthcare, and then others. So that's the distribution of our sample on a more detailed basis in the various subsectors of the economy. But as you can see, the sample is dominated by services, and then in particular those in the retail and wholesale trade. In terms of how long the businesses have been operating for, so we asked about, for those operating between 1 and 3 years, 4 to 10, 11 to 15, and then above 15 years. And that's the distribution that we have there. And you'll see that predominantly most of the businesses turned out to be between 4 to 10 years. I don't know whether to classify that as young or old, but for 4 to 10 years is where most of them are concentrated. And then also, we looked at the businesses in terms of the number of staff employed. We asked that question of the businesses. So the classification, the categorization is 1 to 5 staff, 6 to 30, 30 to 100, 101 to 500, and above 500. And predominantly, most of the businesses seem to be small, employing about 1 to 5 persons. Normally, we would want to survey both small and large-scale businesses. But in this particular sample, we see that most of them are small and medium-scale, enterprises. It's good that we focus attention on them, because most of the time when we do these surveys, we ask questions of only the big firms, and we ignore the SMEs, who rather, form the backbone of the economy. In fact, most of them operate in the so-called informal sector, which is a very large sector of the economy. So this time around, it's good that maybe we are focusing attention on them and listening to what problems they face in their businesses. Then we also looked at the businesses in terms of their market focus. In other words, do they produce only for the domestic market, or do they produce for the domestic market and exports, or domestic market and imports? Do they export only or import only? So that's the kind of classification that we have there in terms of market focus. And again, if you look, you can see the bars, from wherever you are. You see that most of the businesses turn out to operate in they said domestic market only. In other words, they produce for the domestic market only. They are dominant in the sample. And this is followed by those that said we operate in the domestic market and imports. So the dominant area is those producing for only the domestic market, and followed by those who produce for the domestic market and also import. So now, this is the background of the businesses. Now we go on to the questionnaire itself, and then what responses we receive from them. Now, the first question we asked the businesses is to tell us what has been their performance in the last 6 months. Now, as I said, we conducted a survey between July and September. So when you talk about the last 6 months, that is the 6 months preceding the time of the survey, compared to the 6 months preceding those 6 months. And we have been in a COVID environment for more than a year. So you can, in looking at the responses, you can feel that the businesses are reacting to how severe the COVID has been. We have had very tight, sometimes very tight, policies, lockdowns and so on, and then we have eased somewhat. So all these interventions have affected, the businesses. So in that context, we see that, the majority of the businesses said, we haven't, experienced much change in performance in the last 6 months. Of course, that's what they are saying, so we have to report to them, So, and then this is followed by those that said we have experienced worse performance, okay? And those who have said we have done better are in the minority, okay? Well, I don't know whether we should say we should, in line with our expectation. You have to be familiar with as I said, the interventions that have gone on in the last 6 months as opposed to the previous 6 months to be able to appreciate, the response of the businesses. Now, we also ask the businesses to look forward to the next 6 months and tell us how they expect their businesses to do. And then here also, majority of them said they expect no change, no significant change in their business performance in the next 6 months. And a significant number also said we are expecting a better business performance in the next 6 months. In other words, some of them were hopeful, they have high expectations going forward. Others said we expect to, well, in fact, the majority said we expect to remain the same. But those who said we would rather do worse in the next 6 months were in the majority, in the minority. Sorry, they were in the minority. And we get a sense that, the businesses expect, maybe the COVID environment to improve somewhat, and therefore that's why they have this kind of expectations. Now, we also ask the businesses to tell us to what extent we suggested some areas of business operations, and then we asked them to what extent, those areas were affected. Those areas of their business were affected again in the last 6 months. And we asked questions about COVID-related expenditure, cost of operations, their profits, employment or number of staff, sales, if it's goods or services, and insurance premiums, and then fiscal capital expenditure or investments. And so these areas, to what extent were they affected in the last 6 months? That's the question we asked of them. And if you look at the responses, you see the longest bar that's upstairs there is the COVID-19 related expenditure. And the yellow bar is referring to, if you look at the legend, is reduced. That's what they are saying. In other words, most of the companies are saying that in the last 6 months of reference, their COVID-related expenditure had reduced most. Again, reading into the COVID environment, maybe we can understand why, because these 6 months that we're talking about is about the time that we had eased, the government had eased, the conditions, a bit compared to the previous 6 months. So it's like the companies are saying that our COVID-related expenditures were much higher in the previous 6 months compared to the 6 months of reference here. I think that's the point that they are making. But then they also said that their cost of operations have increased most, during the last 6 months. And that is the blue, is the green bar, cost of operations. And you see that's in terms of increase, that's the longest there. We also asked the companies about, their expectations going forward about these areas, the following areas of businesses. And so we asked them about fiscal capital expenditure. What are their expectations in respect of that going forward? And then sales, employment, profits, cost of operations, COVID-19 expenditure. So those questions that we asked of them earlier, we said, this are look forward and tell us how they will be affected, and whether they will increase, they will be maintained, or they will be reduced. Now, they predominantly, the answers show that they said profits will most increase going forward. Again, you can understand that many of them have suffered hardship, during the COVID era. So they are looking forward and saying that we expect things to improve, and therefore our profits are likely to increase. And then they said, looking for COVID-related expenditure will most reduce. In other words, they must have incurred a lot of, COVID-related expenditure before, but looking forward, they are saying that they are likely to reduce. We also asked them about their expectations about the macroeconomic conditions. Macroeconomic conditions here, we included the exchange rate, average lending rate, inflation, economic growth. There's taxes here. Oh, okay. So what are your expectations in the next 6 months with respect to these macroeconomic conditions? And if you look at the bars, in terms of whether they will increase, remain the same, or decrease. Now, if you look at the bars, again, we selected that economic growth will most increase. This is their expectation. Of course, that is what we all expect, that the economy, was battered in 2020. We expect some modest recovery this year. So I think it's a similar sentiment that the businesses are, expressing. And then they will say inflation will most reduce. COVID had pushed our inflation, up significantly. And so it was the business's expectation that inflation will come down, going forward. We hope they are right. Now, we also asked them about the business environment as a whole. We have asked them questions about how they are performing. Now, we want them to tell us about how they see the business environment. And this has to do with the regulatory environment, taxes, credit, availability of credit, access to credit, cost of services, electricity, and so on. All these, add up to the business environment. And then we ask them what they think about the business environment in the last 6 months. Now, predominantly, that's the blue color there. That's no change is the blue color. Improved is the green, and then worsened is the yellow. Now, predominantly, a large majority said they don't think the business environment has changed much in the previous 6 months. Well, so that is what they are saying. And then we also ask them to look forward to the next 6 months. And what are their expectations about the business environment? And the brown color, as an overwhelming majority saying, we expect the business environment to improve, going forward. So all those factors that I mentioned, maybe they expect some improvements in taxes, regulatory environment, cost of credit, and so on. So they are looking at all these factors and saying we expect things to improve going forward. And followed by those who said they don't expect any change. I don't think we have anybody saying that they expect it to worsen, so which is positive. They are very optimistic looking forward. Now, in fact, this is probably the most important question, or one of the most important questions, and this is about constraints facing your business. I mean, this is a question that in any survey like this, you can't avoid asking it. You have to ask them, what do you think are the constraints facing your business? And then because we're doing this in a COVID environment, we had to slot in, COVID. Has it become a major constraint? If we're not doing this in a COVID environment, it will not be there. So we asked about COVID, the high cost of corruption in public institutions, difficulty in obtaining a license or permits, unstable exchange rate, high government taxes and charges, low or insufficient demand for your products or whatever you are producing, goods or services. Is that the main constraint? Lack of skilled workers for you, poor infrastructure in the country as a whole, excessive influx of imports, those who are in the imports. Well, in fact, not even imports. Those who are producing, they may complain, may have issues about too much imports coming in from the outside, cheap imports. I think that's why government has responded in the recent budget by trying to change the previous discount, the benchmark policy, the discount. Because the companies were complaining that imports coming in, they couldn't compete with those imports. So that's a question that we ask. And then high cost of credit, that's always an issue. It's something that, has, affected this economy for a very long time. If you compare us with our peers, the cost of credit in neighboring countries are much lower than here. High utility charges is also an issue, and then the high cost of your own inputs. Now, the number one, the longest graph, the longest bar there, if you look at the graph, is about high utility charges. This is what the companies, the businesses with survey said, this is the most important constraint facing us, high utility charges. Again, we also know that utility charges in Ghana, utility tariffs, are relatively high. Businesses complain a lot. It's a very large input as far as businesses are concerned, electricity. And our tariffs relatively compared to our peers is said to be very high. And this reflects inefficiencies in both power generation and then distribution. We know that ECG and Gridco, they lose a lot when they are distributing power. And all these inefficiencies are passed on in higher tariffs to consumers because the companies want to recover their costs, so-called costs. But these costs have lots of inefficiencies in them. And then they also said high government taxes and charges. That's not the number 2, constraint. Of course, in the end, as we said, we will, formulate recommendations from these results and pass it on to policymakers. So we'll draw government's attention to what at least this sample of businesses are saying. Of course, the 2022 budget has already been passed. I don't think there were the taxes that were introduced. There wasn't many of them there that affected businesses directly. Most of them it seems like most of them were targeted rather to consumers. And then they said high rates of public corruption. Well, that one, the businesses are saying they feel it, they experience it, in their dealings. So that's the third most important constraints facing them. In fact, this is this sample of businesses. I'm sure that if you sample, you survey a different sample, they may rank these factors differently. But this particular sample, this is what they have chosen. This set. Of course, you can go on to add some more in that order of importance. But these are the 3 key ones that they mentioned. And then we asked them, so what kind of critical interventions do you think government should pursue to improve the business environment for you? What kind of critical interventions? And then, so we suggested reduce government taxes and charges, restrict influx of imports, stabilize the macroeconomic environment, reduce corruption in public institutions, improve infrastructure. In other words, it's the constraints that we're turning them around and asking them. So those constraints, that face businesses, which of them do you want government to deal with, to tackle, to address, that will help you improve the business environment? And then we have reduce the cost of credit, reduce utility prices, and boost consumer demand. So in looking at their responses, the longest bar there on the left is reduce government taxes and charges. Yeah, the brown bar is about, the first choice. So we have first choice, second choice, and third choice. Those are the graphs there. So the one with the longest bar is reduce government taxes and charges. And then the second choice, the highest choice, second choice, is stabilize the macroeconomic environment. And then reduce the cost of credit. Of course, stabilize the macroeconomic environment entails, the macroeconomy entails a lot of factors there. It could be inflation, the exchange rate, and so on. So they are all factored in there. So reduce government taxes and charges is the topmost priority for them, as in terms of government intervention to help them stabilize the macroeconomy or reduce the cost of credit. Reduce the cost of credit has been a concern. I mean, the president has charged the Bank of Ghana, to do something about it. But it looks like we are nowhere near finding a solution to the problem. If you go to our neighboring countries, the cost of credit is relatively low, and it is important for investment and economic growth. Our cost of credit is so high that this is a drag on investment and also economic growth. So this is the survey. I mean, the questions we asked them, their responses, and so on. And our attempt to summarize these responses so far. So in terms of the businesses that we surveyed, as we noted, they were largely in the services sector, most of them, and then also in the service sector, retail and wholesale trade. And we said that these were more accessible and responsive, to us. In the future, it could be a different kind of, sample, and especially as we extend it across the nation, it could be a different kind of, sample focus. Then most of them were also 4 to 10-year-old businesses, and that's where most of them were concentrated. And then they were also, small, employing just 1 to 5, staff. So it looks like it's mostly concentrated on the SMEs, small and medium-scale enterprises. And as I said, normally when most surveys pay more attention to large businesses, but I think that for once, it's good that we also want to listen to these small and medium-scale enterprises, who are coming up, because they are really the backbone of the economy. And then most of the businesses we surveyed said we operate mostly in the domestic market. In other words, they produce, whether they are goods or services, for the domestic market, rather than in the external market, that's import or export. Now, in terms of their responses, in terms of their performance in the last 6 months, as we noted, majority reported no change in their performance in the last 6 months. And then also, looking forward to the next 6 months, again, majority said we don't expect any significant change in our performance going forward. In terms of what areas of their operations were affected most in the last 6 months, the cost of operations, they say, had increased most in the last 6 months. On the other hand, they also said the cost of COVID-related expenditure had reduced most. And again, as I said, it is because, the 6 months that of reference here, it's a period that, policy had been, relaxed a bit. And if you compare to the previous 6 months before this one. So that's why they're saying COVID-related expenditures have reduced most. Now, profits, looking forward, which areas of, again, the operations will be affected most? And they said profits will be affected most in the next 6 months. And they said it will increase. On the other hand, they said cost of COVID-19 related expenditure will most reduce in the next 6 months, looking forward. And this is because behind them they had incurred a lot of COVID-related expenditure, and then they expect some relief going forward. Now, in terms of the macroeconomic conditions, in the next 6 months, most businesses said they expect economic growth to pick up, as everybody else is expecting in the next 6 months. And then they also said they expect inflation, or maybe the cost of living, to come down a bit, because we know that the COVID era inflation has increased. But the business seems to say that in the next 6 months they expect inflation to come down. And then in terms of the business environment, in the last 6 months, a large majority said they don't expect, they didn't see any change in the last 6 months. And I believe we should add another one that says, going forward, they said they expect some improvement in the business environment going forward. I think we should add that.